My son's wife threw away every photo of me and told the children grandfather does not exist anymore. 8 months later, I knocked on the school gate and the principal said, "Sir, we have been waiting for you." She removed 31 years of my face from that house, one photograph at a time, told two small children their grandfather was simply gone now, and did it so quietly that 8 months passed before I understood what was actually happening behind that front door. She came very close to getting away with it. I say very close because she forgot one thing. She forgot I spent 31 years inside that school district, and the people who work in schools have long memories for the people who looked after them. Tell me your city, I'd love to know where you're watching from. My name is Norbert Halcrow, and I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a school district superintendent in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which means I attended more meetings than any reasonable person should survive, drank enough bad institutional coffee to fill a respectable lake, and developed the particular skill of sitting perfectly still while someone talks for 40 minutes about something that could have been an email. I retired 14 months ago. My wife Cecile threw a party. She told everyone it was a retirement celebration. I have always suspected it was a party for herself. She has never denied this. Cecile is 61. She has kept a paper calendar on the kitchen wall for as long as I can remember, color-coded by category, and she has never once missed an appointment in her adult life. She also has the particular gift of being able to read my face from across a room and know exactly which kind of trouble we are in before I have said a word. 38 years of marriage either develops that skill or destroys the marriage. In our case, it did the first thing. We got lucky. Our son Marcus is 36. He married Jolene 8 years ago. They have two children, Petra, who is 9, and Daniel, who is 7. Jolene and I were never close, and I want to be honest about that because I think the story is cleaner if I am. There was always something slightly unresolved between us. She had grown up in a family where her own father had been absent for long stretches, unreliable in ways that had left marks on her, and I think somewhere in the architecture of how she saw older men, I occupied a category I had not earned but could not argue my way out of either. I reminded her of someone she had reasons to distrust. We never talked about it directly. I should probably have pushed for that conversation years earlier. I did not. That is my part in this. If you're still watching, subscribe before I tell you what happens next. For the first 5 years, things were fine. Holidays together, birthday cakes, the occasional Sunday dinner where Cecile and Jolene found common ground talking about things Marcus and I were both too oblivious to notice. There were photographs on their wall. One of my favorites was from a lake trip 2 summers before everything changed. Petra holding a fish she had just caught, then immediately dropping it and screaming, and in the frame you can see my face going from proud to laughing in real time. Then things began to shift, and I noticed it the way you notice a draft before you find the open window. Jolene stopped responding to my texts directly. She had never been effusive, but before there had at least been an answer with her name on it. Now Marcus would reply for her, always sounding a half note too cheerful, as though he had been briefed on what to say. I told myself it was a busy season. They had 2 young children. Life compresses. Then in March I came for Petra's 9th birthday and I noticed the photo wall in their hallway had been rearranged. The framed picture of Petra and me from the lake trip was gone. A farmhouse painting was there instead. I stood in that hallway for a moment and I thought about it, and then I walked into the kitchen and ate birthday cake and said nothing. Because I told myself people rearrange walls. They do. It happens. A month after that, Cecile leaned over to me in the car on the drive home from a Sunday visit and said very quietly that the shadow box in the living room had changed. The one with the children's first-year photographs. The one where Daniel was in the hospital on his first day and I was beside him with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe what he is looking at. She said it without accusation or alarm. She just said it the way she states things she needs me to hear. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio on low and I did not say anything, and when we got home I went and stood at the kitchen counter for a while looking out at the yard, and Cecile made tea and put a cup next to me and did not ask me to explain myself. I chose to believe there was a reason I was not seeing. I am not sure whether that was patience or cowardice. Probably some mixture. What I did not know, because no one had told me, was that behind that front door Jolene had been conducting something deliberate and systematic. She had gone through every room and removed every photograph that included my face. She threw away the birthday card Daniel had kept in his dresser drawer, the one I had written a long note in that he said he wanted to keep. She donated the wooden puzzle set I had brought back from Prince Edward Island, the one Petra had been genuinely attached to. And she had been telling the children, in the flat informational tone adults use when they want children to receive something as fact rather than opinion, that grandfather was not part of their family anymore. Grandfather is gone now. We do not talk about him. Said calmly, said repeatedly, until it settled into the furniture of their understanding. Marcus did not stop it. I have turned that over many times in the months since. What I have come to believe is that he had spent 8 years trying to keep peace in that house, and by the time this started he had lost the habit of drawing a line. That is not an excuse. It is just what I think happened to my son. I found out on a Tuesday evening in October. My phone rang and the number was Marcus's cell, and I answered expecting Marcus. What I got instead was Daniel's voice, small and slightly uncertain, and he said, "Grandpa?" I said, "Yes, buddy, it's me," and there was a pause, a long one for a 7-year-old. And then he whispered, "Mommy said you were gone." And then he said, "Are you coming back?" I sat down in the kitchen chair. Cecile was in the other room watching something. A nature program. Birds. I sat in that chair and I said yes. I said I am absolutely coming back. I kept my voice as steady as I could because he needed that from me right then. We talked for 4 minutes, maybe 5. He told me Daniel had lost a tooth. Then he heard something in the background and said, "I have to go," and the line went quiet. I sat there for a while. The birds program continued. Cecile came in for a glass of water, and she looked at my face and she sat down across from me without asking a question, and I told her. She set the water glass down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We are getting a lawyer." Not a suggestion, not a question, just a clear statement of what was going to happen next. I called Gerald Osei that night at 8:30. Gerald and I have been friends for 26 years. We met at a school board conference in Regina in 1998 where we were trapped at the same table with a man giving a speech that had no visible ending, and Gerald leaned over at some point and said quietly, "When do you think he is going to realize we have all stopped listening?" I knew immediately that we would be friends. Gerald is 61, recently retired from municipal planning, built like a man who in his youth could have moved furniture for a living and knew it. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Gerald, I need to talk." He said, "I know. Go ahead." I gave him the short version. He listened without interrupting, which he is disciplined about because he knows I talk in a straight line when something matters. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What does Cecile think?" I said, "She already told me to get a lawyer." He said, "Right." He said, "Listen to her." I said I was going to anyway. He said, "I know, but say it out loud so it's official." I said, "I am going to get a lawyer, Gerald." He said, "Good." He said, "Do you want company tonight?" I said no. He showed up 45 minutes later with chips and a thermos of coffee from his place because he claimed mine was always too weak, which has never once been true. We sat at the kitchen table until nearly midnight, and he did not try to solve anything. He just stayed. That is the whole of what a 26-year friendship looks like when it matters most. The next morning I called a family law attorney named Rosalind Thierry. A former colleague had recommended her with the specific words, "She does not coddle anyone, but she wins," which was exactly what I wanted to hear. Her office was on 21st Street in downtown Saskatoon, 4th floor, and everything about the room suggested a person who had very little patience for disorganization. She listened to everything I told her without writing anything down for the first 10 minutes, which I found slightly alarming, and then realized meant she was actually listening. She asked me about specific dates, specific incidents, whether I had kept anything. I told her I had my phone. I told her that back in August, months before the accidental call in October, Daniel had picked up Marcus's phone and dialed me by accident, and what I had was a voicemail. 31 seconds of background noise from inside that house with Jolene's voice in the middle of it saying to Petra that grandfather does not need to be in your head. I had not known at the time what to do with it. I had listened to it twice and saved it and tried not to turn it over too many times in my mind. Rosalind looked at me and said, "That is important." In her particular delivery, that was the equivalent of most people saying we have everything we need. She explained grandparental rights in Saskatchewan in terms I could follow. Courts take documented parental alienation seriously when there is evidence of a prior meaningful relationship that has been deliberately disrupted. I needed specifics, not impressions. She also asked whether I had any official connection to the children that had not been severed, anything on record that predated Jolene's campaign, something institutional. That was when I thought of the school. Petra and Daniel both attended Riverside Elementary on Attridge Drive. I knew the principal there, a woman named Janet Kowalczyk, who had been a vice principal at one of the district schools during my last years as superintendent. She was sharp, fair, well-organized, the kind of administrator who remembered the details that mattered. We had not spoken in over a year, but I knew her. I drove to the school on a Wednesday morning in November. Cold day, the kind where the air has a clean edge to it. I parked on the street and buzzed the office through the gate intercom and gave my name. There was a pause. Then the gate buzzed open, and Janet came out herself. Not a staff member, not a secretary. Janet herself, in her coat. And she walked toward me and extended her hand and said, "Norbert, we have been waiting for you to come in." I said, "I beg your pardon." She said, "Your name is still on the emergency contact records for both children. Both of them." She said, "No one ever filed to have it changed." She said, "We noticed you had stopped coming in and we wondered." I stood at that gate in the November cold, and I said, "Thank you, Janet," and I meant about 12 different things by it, and she seemed to understand all of them. Rosalind filed for court-ordered grandparental access the week after. What she submitted was not thin. It included the voicemail from August. It included the timeline I had written out over 3 evenings at the kitchen table with Cecile sitting across from me, both of us going through every incident we could remember with dates attached. It included a statement from a neighbor of Marcus and Jolene's, a woman named Patricia who had lived 3 houses down for 6 years and who had heard Jolene say to Petra outside one afternoon, clearly and without lowering her voice, that grandfather is not your family anymore and you do not need to be sad about it. Patricia had mentioned it to Cecile weeks earlier, not knowing what to do with it, and Cecile had written it down and said nothing to me yet because she was still deciding when to bring it up. That is my wife. She collects the evidence and waits for the right moment, and it included my continued presence on both children's emergency contact records at the school, which established that my relationship with those grandchildren had been real and active and had been deliberately severed from one direction only. The hearing took 3 weeks to schedule. Jolene's attorney argued that my visits had simply become infrequent over time and that the children had adjusted naturally to a smaller family circle. Rosalind asked the court to play the voicemail. She asked the court to note that not one photograph of me remained in that home. She asked the court to note Patricia's statement, the specific language used, the specific audience it was directed at. She asked the court to note that despite 8 months of systematic removal, I was still on the school's emergency contact list because no one had thought to check there. The family court granted full grandparental access every second weekend and 1 weekday evening per month, court-ordered and enforceable. Marcus did not contest it after the hearing. He called me on the Sunday following, and the conversation was not easy. There were long silences and partial sentences, and at one point he said I should have done something sooner, and I said yes, and then I said I know it was not simple, and he said it was not an excuse, and I said I know that too. We did not resolve everything on that call. We are not going to resolve everything on one call. But we stayed on the line for 40 minutes, and that was something. Jolene did not call. She has not called since. I do not know what she will do with the resentment she has been carrying, the one she never brought to me directly. That conversation still needs to happen. Maybe it will, eventually. But it is not something I can want for her. She has to want it herself. The first court-ordered visit was a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the ruling. I pulled up to the end of the driveway at 10 in the morning. Petra came out first in her blue coat, the one with the broken zipper that someone had fixed with a safety pin. Daniel was behind her with his hat on sideways, which is a choice he has made for approximately 2 years and refuses to revisit. We went to the Science Center on Diefenbaker Drive. We had soup at the diner on 8th Street, where the woman behind the counter knows my order and brought Daniel an extra bread roll he accepted with the solemn gravity of someone receiving something officially important. On the drive home, Petra was quiet for a stretch. Then she said, "Grandpa, did you go somewhere?" I said, "No, sweetheart." I said, "I have been here the whole time." She looked out the window for a moment, and then she said okay and went back to watching the streets go past. Daniel had fallen asleep against the car door with his hat still sideways. Gerald came for dinner that evening. Cecile made a roast that deserved its own occasion. Gerald brought a bottle of wine and described it as unpretentious and complex, which are not words that belong in the same sentence, but Gerald has always felt conventional logic applied to other people. We sat at the table and I told them about the bread roll and about Petra asking whether I had gone somewhere. Gerald raised his glass and said to the emergency contact list. Cecile raised hers and said to Janet Kowalczyk. I raised mine and said to Daniel's hat. We drank. Later I went to make tea and I could hear them in the other room. Cecile telling some story with her hands the way she does when she gets going. Gerald laughing at the punchline. A real laugh. The kind that bounces off walls. I stood at the kettle and I let myself be still for a moment. I thought about Daniel on the phone in October, his small voice asking whether I was coming back. I thought about Janet walking toward me across that schoolyard saying, "We have been waiting for you." The kettle clicked off. I poured the tea and carried it in and set it on the table. Cecile said, "You missed the funny part." I said, "Tell me again." She said, "It loses something in the retelling." I said I would like to hear it anyway. So she told me again. It was better the second time. These things usually are.